Hello there, this is Mr. Loran, and welcome to the first lecture of Unit 2, Reconstruction. In this unit, we'll be taking a look at the time period from 1865 through 1877, in which the United States was faced with the great challenge of reuniting the country after the tragic and disastrous Civil War. Today, we're going to take a look at all of the issues surrounding the idea of Reconstruction, all of the fighting that would go on over who would control Reconstruction, as well as look specifically at the first 2 years of Reconstruction, which became known as Presidential Reconstruction, in which President Lincoln and President Andrew Johnson were directing Reconstruction. To begin with, let's identify what Reconstruction really meant. The United States was going to face a major challenge in attempting to reintegrate both a formerly slave population and a formerly rebellious population back into the country. It was a very difficult time. There was a lot of animosity and anger on both sides as a result of the Civil War and all of the lives that had been lost. And so basically, the country needed to decide how exactly this was going to happen. And the problem was centered around there were so many different ideas on how it should be done. Many believed that this was the case. The presidents believed that they wanted the South back as quickly as possible, that the South had suffered enough as it was. Unfortunately, there were members of Congress and other members of the country that were more of this opinion. And so as you can see, with all the different ideas and emotions running high, this was not going to be as easy as it may have seemed to bring the country back together and for everyone to be able to move on after the Civil War. Now, Reconstruction needed to address many questions, and it was very complex. The first question was who should control the process. Congress wanted to have their say in how it would go. The presidents obviously believed they knew best on how Reconstruction should be taken care of. And then you had the southern states who wanted, their input on how things would be done. So there was going to be a lot of fighting amongst these groups on who should control the process of Reconstruction. Secondly, how would the South be reintegrated into the Union? As I said before, the presidents believed it should be done quickly as possible. Some of the radical Republicans in Congress believed that the South should have to jump through many hoops and take many steps in freeing the slaves and guaranteeing the freedom of slaves and many other things in order to be brought back into the Union. 3, how would the South be rebuilt? The South had been completely and utterly destroyed during the Civil War. We'll take a look at that in an upcoming slide. 4, how would the liberated blacks fare as free men and women? Should the government help them in this transition? They had worked as slaves their entire life. They were not educated. They did not have a lot of skills other than working on plantations. How would this transition take place, and would the government be involved in protecting their freedom and their rights? And finally, 5, what should be done with the leaders of the Confederacy? Some believe they should be exiled, sent to a foreign country, not allowed to live in the United States any longer. Others believe they should have a simple slap on the wrist and be brought back into the country. I mean, just think of this. If you're a parent and your child runs away and you get them back, they come back, are you going to punish them severely? I mean, what would be the result of that? You now have them back. And there's a lot of parallels to that and what the country was trying to do with the South in differing views on should the South be punished, should they not be punished, how should it be done. They didn't want it to happen again, but yet, they wanted to be able to move on and so forth. The devastation of the South. The South was a mess. It was in ruins, physically, all of the fighting had taken place there. There were not many major cities, but the cities have been destroyed. Much of the land had been destroyed. The plantations had been devastated. Railroad tracks had been ripped up, bridges burned, and so forth. Economically, the South was in a disastrous state. Their money was worthless. The transportation system had broken down. Their wage or their labor system had been taken away from them. And so the economy was in a desperate state. And politically, there was no direction. The North tried to influence what was going on politically after the war. That led to Southern defiance. There was a corruption in the government and the elected officials. Early on, white Southerners were being elected, rich white Southerners, and their local government looked no different than it had before. And this irritated the North, some Northerners. And so for one of the first steps in Reconstruction was the South was going to need to be rebuilt so the Southerners would feel a little bit better about themselves, because right now they were feeling a lot of anger, a lot of animosity toward the North for losing the war and for their entire way of life being disrupted. Here's a picture of Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederate States, and you can see most of the buildings were destroyed. That was also the case with Charleston, South Carolina. And so, as I said before, there weren't a lot of major cities, only a few, but the rest of the South looked like this as well. Moving on to the second part of today's lecture, presidential Reconstruction, which took the first 2 years of the Reconstruction period, 1865 through 1867. And as was stated before, Lincoln and Johnson believed that the South had suffered enough as it was, and they needed to bring them back in as quickly as possible. And as you can see by Lincoln's 10% plan, it was just like a slap on the hand. He believed, this is maybe the touchy-feely part of Reconstruction. According to his plan, first of all, the states would have to ratify the 13th Amendment, which was abolishing slavery. And then 10% of the voters had to swear an allegiance. That's only 1 in 10. Obviously, radical Republicans did not believe this was tough enough. And the last part of Lincoln's 10% plan was there was no protection for freed African Americans. The government was not going to guarantee their citizenship. The government was not going to help them in the transition from slavery to freedom. It was going to be left up to them. Remember, Lincoln fought the war to preserve the Union. He was not a radical Republican. He was a moderate Republican. It was the radical Republicans that wanted to end slavery and so forth. So this would be a faction of the government that would start pushing toward other methods, other means in Reconstruction. But Lincoln was not one of them. His plan can basically be summed up by this.
It's time to move on. It's time to get going. What lies ahead, I have no way to know. But under my feet, baby, grass is growing. It's time to move on. Time to get going.
Unfortunately for the country, and especially the South, on April 14th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. He was the first United States president to be assassinated, and the nation was shocked by this incident. And the South maybe cheered it in the beginning because Lincoln represented everything that had gone wrong for them during the Civil War and the whole struggle versus federal government versus states' rights and slavery versus anti-slavery. But as time would go on, they would realize that they lost a very important proponent of the Southern cause of reunification. And things for them likely would have gone much better in Reconstruction if Abraham Lincoln would have been guiding it.
I'm so sad, sad.
Once Lincoln was assassinated, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, assumed the presidency. Now, Johnson was a Democrat from Tennessee, which is interesting Why would Abraham Lincoln, a moderate Republican, choose a Democrat as his running mate in 1864? Well, Lincoln realized that the war was nearly over and that the process of Reconstruction was going to be occurring soon, and he believed that this might be a message to the South of him reaching out to welcome them back when he selected a Democrat, which most of the Southerners were Democrats, from Tennessee, which was a somewhat southern state, that this would be a way of him showing the South that he was concerned with what was happening to the South. But once Lincoln was assassinated, this became a major problem because the radicals in Congress, the radical Republicans, believed Johnson was too lenient on the South. Johnson started vetoing all kinds of bills. He was blatantly racist. So any bill that Congress passed attempting to help the slaves, the former slaves, Andrew Johnson vetoed it. So there was going to be a power struggle that would ensue between Johnson and Congress. Now, Johnson's plan, much along the lines of Lincoln's, was also lenient. He also insisted that the states ratify the 13th Amendment. He stated very clearly that there be no vote for African Americans and no protection for freed blacks. One thing that he was requiring was that the southern states had to pay their own war debts. The United States government was not going to assume the war debts for the states that had seceded and attempted to free themselves from the United States. Pardons would be given to Confederates who came to him and personally apologized to him. He would grant them their citizenship. So Johnson's plan went more along the lines of this.
Take it easy, take it easy.
And that concludes the first lecture of Unit 2. Today we went over the overview of the complexity of Reconstruction, the major issues involved, and President Lincoln and Johnson's plans for Reconstruction. But by no means are we anywhere near the completion of this time period. In the next lecture, we are going to take a look at Reconstruction and its impacts on the newly freed slaves and how their lives would be changed during this period.